chance to sit down and watch the film, and I've got to say, congratulations. It is an amazing film.
Oh, thanks, man. I really appreciate it. That means a lot.
So, Eric, tell us a little bit about why you decided to make this film. Where did the idea first come about for you to sit down and make the film?
Well, I had, this is actually now my third film that I've made. And last year I was in the winter, my winter here in the United States. So in January of last year, I had picked up some work, and at the end of that gig, I had planned on making another film. And I had an idea, and it was going to be, pretty much low to no budget. I was going to make it by myself, and then all of a sudden, in March, the coronavirus pretty much shut everything down, and I still wanted to make a film when my pay-in gig was up in May of last year, and I had to shift gears because having the pandemic meant that I very likely wouldn't be able to convince actors to work with me, at least not for extended periods of time, and have close proximity and close interactions. And what had happened was I was living in New York City and moved to northern New York in the Adirondack Mountains. And right in that area is where the siege of Fort William Henry and a lot of battles of the French and Indian War took place. And the story of the siege of Fort William Henry is kind of the backbone of The Last of the Mohicans, which is actually my favorite movie. So it all kind of gelled and came together there, and I figured, I love documentaries, and I actually love the documentary filmmaking process, and I figured that would be kind of, given my circumstances and the circumstances of the world at the time, would be the thing that I would be most likely to be able to complete and have be a compelling and engaging story, given the realities of not really being able to work with a lot of other people, basically.
Yeah. Did COVID still cause some issues for you while you were filming? Because I know that I've spoken to directors in the last few weeks that have had to work with some really weird restrictions. I had one director tell me that his cast all had to stay in the studio for the entire time that they were filming. What kind of restrictions did you have, and did it still affect the way that you went about making the film?
It did definitely affect the way I went about making it. When I first was deciding on what topic I was going to, what my next film would be, and then ultimately wound up with this topic, initially I was actually preparing to be able to not film anyone.
Yeah.
And that's actually how I came up with the idea to incorporate a lot of kind of 3D animations, which honestly I think I might have gone down that road anyway, just because even if there was no pandemic, it wouldn't be practical for me as one guy to try to film a compelling looking siege of 9,000 French soldiers attacking 2,000 British soldiers.
Yeah.
That's not something that I personally currently have the resources to try to pull off. But fortunately, by the time that I rolled around to really digging my teeth into making the documentary, I had made a kind of a proof of concept teaser video where I incorporated a lot of animation, and then I actually filmed myself in some reenactments, and I put that out online, and thankfully got quite a bit of interest. And the folks who run the Fort William Henry Museum, which is a recreation of the fort, and there's an enthusiastic group of French and Indian War reenactors who thankfully, some of those folks had reached out to me, and I was able to get permission to film at the fort, and got a few gentlemen who are reenactors who had agreed to be filmed for a day or two here and there, so that I was able to have much better quality and much more immersive reenactments as opposed to me exclusively filming myself, which ultimately, I would have made it work, and there are some shots still in the film that are me. I filmed myself, and I roped my mother and my wife into operating the camera at certain times. But, ultimately, just having some of the restrictions be lifted last summer as I progressed definitely paid off and made a final product, which is much better than if I hadn't been able to interact with folks a little bit more.
Definitely. And how did you go about doing your research as well? Because that was one of the things that really struck me about this film, was how much great information comes through in this film. How did you go about doing all of your research?
My and I read through those books, and then what I did was I actually started poring over the bibliography section of all those books, and thankfully here in the States, the Library of Congress, the National Archives, the New York State Library, they all have a pretty good amount of their materials available online. And then also a big resource too was it's called archive.org.
Yep.
And they have a ton of great things. So there's one journal that I use in the film. It's Colonel Joseph Fry's journal. He was part of the Massachusetts Regiment. That journal gets cited everywhere in any book, any article you can read on the topic, but it's almost impossible to find the actual journal. And then eventually I was able to find a digital reproduction of the periodical, which I don't remember the name of, but the first time this journal was published was in the 1820s. And so that original periodical where the journal was published lives online and I was able to source it from archive.org. So it actually took me, months. I was, still doing research, well into probably post-production, I guess. And, kind of having to go back and rewrite some of the script and, reconfigure some of the voiceover that was used with the various voice actors reading from these journals. But yeah, basically it's just kind of a thanks to the internet and technology being what it is. And again, this is actually a benefit I had because of the coronavirus lockdowns. A lot of private libraries and online sources were actually giving away either discounted or free memberships last year because people couldn't physically go to their location. So to compensate, they were, scrambling to basically digitize and get as much of their library content online as possible. So I was thankfully able to benefit from that.
You mentioned that Last of the Mohicans is one of your favorite films. When you were doing your research into the battle, though, what were some of the interesting things that you discovered that you didn't know previously?
Well, a big one is that, which I think a lot of folks don't realize, is that, for one thing, in the Last of the Mohicans, the movie, it's not really presented as the siege lasting for 6 days.
Yep.
But the biggest one is that the majority of the British troops and the British colonials were actually housed in an encampment that was, about a quarter mile or so away from the fort. Yep. So there was only about 400 men inside the fort, and then probably an additional 1,800 men on a hillside to the southeast of Fort William Henry. And that's where not only were the majority of the troops there, but that's actually where most of the action of the siege took place. That's where the Native Americans spent the majority of the time attacking that encampment. That's where the excuse me, the famous massacre that where the Indians attacked the retreating troops. That's where that all happened, was at the encampment, not at the fort.
Yep.
So I kind of feel like that to me is kind of the, was the biggest revelation and probably the most obvious discrepancy between at least the movie and, the actual historical events.
Wow.
Was that. And there was also, just a whole number of skirmishes that took place leading up to the siege, around the siege, and it in the movie and in the book to some degree, it at least in my mind, it wasn't quite as clear just how, by modern standards, how close reinforcements really were. 16 miles by today's standards is not that far. But
yep.
When you look through the mountainous and forested terrain of the Adirondack Mountains, it's kind of easy to understand that, okay, well, trying to get several thousand men 16 miles over this rugged terrain is actually quite a feat,
Definitely. Well, Erik, the result is an absolutely fantastic documentary. So to finish off, I would like to ask, what would you like to say to everybody out there before they sit down and watch this amazing film?
Well, thanks. I appreciate you saying how great it is. Thank you. What I would say is, like when you're sitting down to watch it, one thing to keep in mind is that what I did with putting this together, I tried to really let the historic text and the historic maps and basically the documents from 1755 to 1757 tell the story the best I could. And, the gaps are filled in with narration and with some talking head interviews, but the bulk of the story is told from the perspective of the men who were there, and it's told based on their journals and their words handed down through history. So some of it might not necessarily be what exactly happened. There's even a scene late in the movie where I have a British journal directly contradict what a French journal says.
Yep.
And, as with anything, as we know in modern society too, and modern, happenings, that especially in the middle of a siege and a battle, something that happens 10 feet away, you might not even see as a first-hand observer. So for all you know, that didn't happen. So I feel like that's something that needs to be taken into account when you're watching it. And, and also think about the political biases. For example, the French journals are not going to want to talk about any bad things that they did, whereas the British journals are not going to want to talk about their loss. They're going to want to talk about how terrible the French soldiers behaved.
Yep.
So I would keep all of that in mind and also just kind of enjoy it. Like I tried to, the best I could, make it a cinematic experience. And yes, it is, obviously a historical event, and I want people to learn some history from it. But more importantly, I just want people to sit down and enjoy and realize, try to imagine what it might have actually been like 264 years ago in, the frontier of New York for these men on all sides of the conflict, and how, terrifying and yet exhilarating at the same time it probably was for them.
Definitely. Well, Erik, thank you so much for taking the time to chat to us today. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you, and we can't wait to see what your next project is going to be.